Hello, I'm Dr. Roger Elmer, Advanced Neurospinal Solutions, and I've been asked to do a little presentation with respect to the Wobble Chair, just to discuss some of the ins and outs of it, to make it a little bit more understandable. Why do we use it? What is it for? What are some of the alternate uses for it? The opportunities and possibilities are only limited by our creativity. And in this case, the Wobble Chair was designed by Dr. Burl Pettibon some time ago. We use it to warm up the tissue. Recall when we've talked before, we talked about the three tissues that have to change. Those three tissues, if we don't change those, we didn't affect a structural correction that is maintainable by the patient after we're done. My job is to put myself out of business. With each patient, and we're working to change the white tissue, the red tissue, and the neural tissue. This is a brief review. The white tissue is the fiber that makes up the discs, the ligaments, the fascia, the fiber, the tendons. All of it's made of a coiled protein called collagen or tropocollagen. That coiled protein has to change shape in order for us to make a change that's maintainable by the patient. That is like orthodontics. You put braces on teeth to change the shape of those ligaments, and it takes quite a time to get that done. Well, we do that with molding. We use decompression to accelerate that molding. We'll talk about that in another segment. But in order to enable us to do something with those white tissues, we're going to have to change its character. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Just a quick review. The red tissue that we're going to be working with is not what everybody else is working with. We're working with instead of the fast twitch phasic voluntary muscle system, which is what PTs and chiros who give exercises, anything that's voluntary, personal trainers, and this is not a negative thing, it just is. They're using the brain, and they're using the voluntary nervous system, which we call the pyramidal nervous system, and we're using the voluntary muscles, which are more surface. They are not the primary stabilizers within the system. And so we are working with the type 1 slow twitch postural muscle fibers, and so we're going to be changing those. We'll talk more on that later. In the neural effect, we have to change. We're not working to change the brain so much as we are to change the brain stem, the cerebellum, and the extrapyramidal nervous system. That's not the nervous system you think with. It thinks you. When you stand and stabilize yourself, when you're lifting something, the voluntary action that you made to lift was done by the pyramidal system and by the brain. The stabilization was done by the extrapyramidal nervous system. And so we are working exclusively with that extrapyramidal nervous system. But in this case, as we talk about the Wobble Chair, right now I'm choosing to focus on just its white tissue effect. What are we trying to do? We want to change its character. The principle is called hysteresis. It's described as the ability to change the character of the tissue so that it becomes more plastic, it becomes more moldable. So we're going to on-off load down its long axis. If we take a spring and on-off load it over and over and over again, that's like what we're doing. As we do that, we're going to decrease its elastic properties by up to 95% for 20 minutes, which is how long we're going to have you on your molds. That's going to allow you the opportunity to make changes in that tissue. You can't do that with braces. The teeth aren't mobile, hopefully. They don't want to make them mobile, and they're just trying to migrate those ligaments, migrate the teeth into new positions, and get them to be there long enough to where they unravel to have an even unraveling. That's really important, because if we pull too hard, we create a process called permanent plastic deformation, which is the same exact thing that happens in a car accident, and you hear the term whiplash. When you overstretch that spring, which is like that. Here's the problem. Only God fixes that, and I'm not him. The other thing it does is it makes it susceptible to injury thereafter. And you can see the area that is susceptible to injury. You will never injure it here or here. You will now always injure it here, and it's easier to injure than it was last time. Many of our injuries are just actually re-injuries of old injuries because we created these flaws. And so if we have a force, and it doesn't even have to be the same exact force we had before, as long as it insults this, as long as it pulls hard enough, and this succumbs, it's going to get re-injured. The other problem that happens when we do this is we learned from Spine 1999. There's a paper that talks about when we have this kind of a process, it creates instability in the joint. It becomes sloppy, kind of like a bike with a bunch of bolts loose, right? That is loose now. That, according to Spine, which is the gold standard for spinal research, says that if we do that, if we have that instability, it desensitizes the mechanoreceptors. Those are the receptors, the nerve endings, or the sensors that describe for the brainstem what's going on in there. Is there pushing? Is there pulling? Is there a compression? Do we know what's going on in there? Because those sensors become desensitized, those nerves no longer send impulses up to the brainstem and cerebellum. What they also describe is that because of that, the reflexive loop, that's the afferent column for you neurologists, the efferent system, as it comes back down, it becomes desensitized. It quits working. So now the muscles that are at the end of it no longer do their job. They also went so far as to say is that the protective mechanism that those reflexogenic systems afford go away. So now we have a bare spine, and that's why you always get injured in the same place, right? Because as it gets more and more unstable, then we wind up with more and more of that desensitization, deadening of the protective mechanism and the job that it does. And we're going to get deep into that in the biomechanics. When I get into the biomechanics of it, I'm doing a whole series on biomechanics. And if you want to learn all of that, it'll be on a different channel, YouTube channel, but it's pretty exciting how that works. But we want to change its shape, unwind it. So we don't want to take and create permanent plastic deformation, which is this injury. We don't want to create that. We want to create an even unwinding so that it maintains its integrity, maintains its ability to do its job, and it maintains its connection in terms of sending information back to the brainstem and allowing that reflexogenic loop to stay in place and do its job the way God intended it to. So that's what we want to create, and the term that we use is adaptive elongation. It's the opposite of what you experience when you drive in your car. You get in your car and drive for a couple of hours. You get at the end of it, you get out, and you notice that your knees are really stiff. That's because you put them in a bent position and those fibers were shortened. And they adapted, we call that adaptive shortening. They went through a process of adaptation to get shorter. And then when you got up, it was difficult to unbend them. But if you put some energy into it, it went back to where it was, back to the normal shape of that ligament maintains. But if you want to truly elongate it, it's going to take a lot of effort, a lot of energy, a lot of stretching, a lot of elongation in order to get it to be there and to stay in that new posture. And we're going to be taking it and beyond that to where we're not only changing its shape vertically, but we're going to change it so that it has a wedge shape so that it maintains the shape of the curve in the lower back. As we do that, then we're going to work to pump the fluid back in. The reason on an MRI it's black, right? It's black because on a T2 weighted MRI, the water is white and all of the discs that have water in it are white internally as compared to the ones that have lost it, and they've become flattened. We call that a disc bulge. Not so bad. It's just like you lost air in your tire, so pump it up. And what we say in here is pump it up. We're going to pump the disc up, and that's part of what the wobble chair is about. So when we look at what we're trying to accomplish, we are trying to create the ability to change the tissues. Now we're going to when we think of warm up traditionally in our country, we tend to think of getting blood flow in, which I'm not disparaging that. Yes, we are trying to do that, but we're more interested in that long axis traction that is going to truly change the tissues, the fibers, so that as they change, we can do something with them. We are preparing them for change. We're going to be stretching them with molding. We're going to be putting weights on, which is going to cause them to be stretched and put in their best possible position, and that we're going to be doing all of that. And so the thing that we say with respect to our therapies is that the prehab makes the rehab. If you lay on molds, which we're going to be doing a series on molding here real quick, if you do your molds without warming up, it's just stretching and it goes right back. We need to on-off load, creating the concept, the principle of hysteresis, so that when we're done and we do our molding, it's actually affecting a change over time. And then we look at those changes on the subsequent X-rays. That's a very exciting time when we're looking at the before and afters and the afters and the afters, and we're seeing it change over time. We can actually measure the difference. Very exciting. So the wobble chair itself, which I have a couple here. One of these has training wheels on it. It's got 2 arms on it. I don't need that. I've been riding my bike for a long time. This is another one. That wobble chair creates the ability to go through a figure 8. That figure 8 is when Dr. Burl Pettibon invented it. He wanted to make something that would assimilate the figure 8 that the pelvis goes through in walking. The problem with doing exercises at your lower back is that if you're standing, you actually lock the lumbar spine mechanically and neurologically so that you have a foundation to stand up against. And so the best position to do actual lumbar exercises is in the seated position, because it unlocks it biomechanically and neurologically, allowing it to go through movement. And you think, well, why don't we use a big ball? Good idea. A big Swiss ball, big exercise ball, love those. But the circumference is just too big. It winds up doing this. It's actually more of a translation than a rotation. The secret sauce of the wobble chair is that it has a pivot that's the same size as the nucleus pulposus of the L5S1 disc. And so it allows this kind of activity. It allows the figure 8 that you go through in walking, which is the same figure 8 that you need to go through to pump fluid to every angle of all the discs in the lumbar spine. Very clever. And so this is what Dr. Burl came up with. Notice how there's a cutout on each side. That's for the legs, so you don't cut off the femoral arteries and wind up with numb legs, while you're doing it too. And so as you sit on the wobble chair, it truly is wobbly, and you're gonna move around with it. And we're gonna spend more time talking about that with the warm-up exercises and that, but that figure 8 is what we're focusing on, and the concept that we are working to change those fibers. Now we couple that with a traction unit, which we're gonna do another video on that in just a minute here, that allows from the skull down to about T7. It actually will get the whole spine, but the focus is from the skull down to T7, and then the wobble chair does the whole spine, but it does a much better job from the pelvis up to about T7, it does its best job. So we put those two together to get the optimal effect, because we want our molding to have the optimal effect. We want to change the shape and the structure of those discs so that they will be what they need to be for the neurology that we're going to change. We're not just going to make a pretty spine. We're going to make it function as close to optimal, as close to spec as we possibly can. So the wobble chair is about that. It's also, we can use it to do things isometrically. We can use it for different types of exercises in that. And those are modifications, things that we've added that some of us have come up with that make it a much more versatile tool. But for right now, all we want to talk about is the basic concept of using it to warm up the tissue and using it to pump up the discs, using it to change the plasticity of the white fibers through hysteresis, so that we can truly change that spine, particularly the white tissue of that spine. Thank you very much.